So today we are presenting on the topic of understanding cultic groups to recognize criminal violence and improve interventions. I am glad to be joined today by the founder and executive director of Info-Cult, Mike Kropveld. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thank you, Sam. Before starting, I would like to say that on behalf of Infocult, I would like to warmly thank our partners who made this week of activities possible. That's the Fondation Emergence, Sagesse, CAVAC, and the Department of Justice Canada for their financial support. A special thank you to our team and our volunteers for their invaluable contributions. And of course, to you, Sam, intervention worker at InfoCult, who coordinated the organization of this week's events. Since Sam's main role at InfoCult is to help former members as well as families and friends of individuals involved in high control slash cultic groups, and because he has valuable insight to share, I see this session as more of an exchange between the two of us than simply a one-man presentation. In addition, this week would not be possible without the contribution of all the presenters who are so generously giving their time and expertise. Thank you to each and every one of you.
So to get things started in our discussion today, I figured that it would be relevant for us to talk a little bit about what we mean when we refer to cultic groups.
The whole thing, I think, what you're asking and what people often ask is, what are you talking about when you talk about this phenomena? And often the problem, I guess, is there's limitations to the use of the different terms that are being used. I think that I see them more as labels. The same when you come up with, or when we talk about cults, cultic groups, cultic phenomena. I think one of the things that one has to be aware of, there's no agreed upon definition for the word cult. It has different meanings to different people. And clearly for former members, it has an impact in terms of framing their experience. But in terms of dealing with the phenomena, in terms of understanding when victimization happens and why people end up in situations where they're abused, whether physically, sexually, it's more important, I think, to understand the phenomena and look at how these groups function and function on a continuum. Because the ideal kind of view is you have groups that are open, democratic, tolerant of others, and respectful of their members and other people, and are versus groups that are intolerant, disrespectful, and often led by authoritarian leaders. The extremes are rarely situations which occur. Most groups will function within that continuum. The question of dealing with this issue is, how do you understand and recognize which groups are potentially more situations where people are at risk of being harmed? And then when they are harmed and victimized, how do we understand why and how this occurs? So I think being very conscious that the labels have limited utilization in terms of really kind of understanding what are the beliefs of the organizations, how do they function, what is the behavior, what is the relationship of leader to members, members to leadership, relationship of the group to the exterior, towards understanding, when abuse happens, how and why does it happen? And I think so. It's a bit more of, I say, of a nuance rather than a black and white approach of trying to simply say this is a cult group, this is not a cult group, but recognize that harm can happen in different kinds of groups, and that's basically what we look at, and is also the subject, the title of a book that I and our president Marie-André Pellant wrote called "The Cult Phenomena: How Groups Function." Because at the bottom, a line, I guess, of this is, how does a group function, and understanding when the abuse occurs, how and why does it occur?
On that note, given that this week we're focusing in on the topic of violence, how how do we see the signs or the red flags that lead us to think that there's a risk that violence may occur or may be already occurring in a group setting?
Well, I think clearly one of the areas you want to look at is how isolated and how closed the group is from the rest of the society. What roles does the authority play? When we talk about closed, I think it's rare that you're going to have a group that's completely close to the outside. There's going to be some kind of contact, but there is, I think, an understanding that there's limited contact with the outside, which means if looking at a group, do members who are involved have contact with former members, have contact with members of their family who are not involved in the organization? What kind of relationship do they have with the rest of society? In other words, do they seek medical treatment? Are they in a public school, or do they run their own school if they have kids within the group? What roles does the leader play? And part of that is looking at also the history of the organization and seeing if there's an evolution. Like groups generally, if you're looking at movements where abuse has occurred, it is not something that occurs from day one. They may have extreme or kind of views and ideas, but it's a process over time where that abuse occurs. So it's a question of looking at the history of the movement. What has the leader been saying? What kind of articles or information has been presented by the group to get a better understanding how they function? What role do the individuals, like I said, have within the movement? Who takes care of, for example, of child rearing and child training? Are parents really responsible for their kids? Or when you look at it more closely, is it's the leader and the leader's dictates that decides how children are kind of, let's say, treated and taken care of. You also, I think, and very importantly, if you're trying to understand it, is look at the terms or not the terms, but the what the group is saying and how do they define certain terms and words that they use. Because if you have situations of abuse, it's not going to be a situation where the group is going to say we're abusing our kids, or we're abusing women, or we're having inappropriate sexual relationships with members in the organization. It's going to be framed in another context. So when groups say something or group literature is written, what does it really mean in the eyes of the organization? In other words, is how do you get into the mindset and view of the world through the eyes of the group, and kind of ascertaining then not only what is the potential risk, because then for abuse, because which makes a group a concern, but also if there is warnings or signs of abuse that's going on, how to understand why that is happening. So these are some of the kind of things that you want to look at, but it pretty much indicates not a summary kind of quick view of the organization, but it requires a bit more of a in-depth kind of evaluation and analysis. So it's staying away from simple kind of, let's say, responses, just because sometimes people assume there's harm going on in a group just because the group has a strange belief or dresses differently or appears kind of, very different from what we're used to. It may be a sign, it may just be simple that they're different, but it also may be a sign of something else, and how to then look further into it to ascertain whether there is a risk or whether the risk is not just a risk but actually going on.
So there's also another aspect that another element of this equation that can really affect how individuals in these settings experience whatever is going on in them, and that is whether they have chosen to enter that environment or whether they were born or raised in it.
Yeah, I think those are two important things that one often forgets. If a person who got involved, and the question often comes up and say, well, I never chose, I was manipulated and exploited. I think the question is, you know, what kind of techniques got you more involved? But generally, people from our experience have gotten involved during a transition period in their life when they're more vulnerable to being approached. It makes them more susceptible to maybe the techniques of recruitment that the group uses. So however they got involved, whether, and some people get involved in groups that we might find kind of very abhorrent and something we may totally disagree with, but they get involved because that's what they may be looking for. Not saying they're looking to be abused, because generally the abuse, if it occurs, does not occur at the beginning stages of the organization, but they're getting involved and they have a previous history and life experience once they're getting involved with the group. I want to underline that people are at a vulnerable stage of their life. I mention that because I think many people, when they look at kind of these kind of environments and when they hear about abuse and extreme kind of behaviors by certain movements, tend to assume people getting involved must be pretty weak-minded and not like me, because I am strong and normal, and that never would occur to me. I think it's recognizing that people are going through a transition period in life, and that's what most people who report, we've talked to, who are former members, and even family members report that person got involved during a transition, during a period where they're under a lot of stress or difficulties and vulnerable, not necessarily weak. Unfortunately, most of us through our life go through ups and downs, and those are the periods when you're more vulnerable to get involved in a situation, which can lead to potentially a harmful kind of experience. Second or multi-generational members, those who are born or raised in a group, don't have a previous or other life experience before, so that what they're going through is, you know, is not the same as the first generation. First generation at least has a point of reference. So that if kind of abuse happens, you may accept it while you're in, but once you're out, you recognize, or once you're thinking of leaving, you recognize this as something unacceptable or not something you want to live with. Whereas a member who's born or raised in it will have a different kind of experience totally. Uh, I guess an example that comes to mind is to kind of reflects what I would say is the normalization process that goes on if you're born and raised, was a question that was asked of a former member of a polygamous group. She was a woman. She was asked, didn't you find it strange when you were in your movement that men of 40 or 50 years old were marrying girls that were 14 or 15? And her response to this was, no, it was normal. That's what she was used to, that which we experienced. So it's understanding those differences that occur between the different generations, between the different, let's say, members that are getting involved or who are involved, are very important to understanding the victimization process, because you're much more conscious of the something being abusive, even though you may frame it differently now that you're a member, versus those who are born and raised, who no point of reference. So what they're experiencing is normal, sadly.
One thing that you mentioned earlier was the way that this is a process that that progresses to this point. And one thing that I think is important to sort of name here is that, as you said, it's not a question of going from starting out from zero with
Mhm.
acts of violence that someone from the outside would immediately recognize as being totally unacceptable,
Mhm.
but that for people who are first generation members, so people who are not raised in these environments, there tends to be a a process of increasing manipulation, exploitation, psychological violence prior
Mhm.
to the development of more extreme practices.
Yeah, I think it's a question of understanding the process that people get involved. Generally, you're not getting involved in a group that's going to say, look, we tend to beat members that don't go along with our rules and regulations, and here's how we deal with children when they don't go along with the rules as well. It's a process. And generally, because as we were just talking about, people are getting involved because of an emotional, like vulnerability at a certain point, uh, they're kind of looking to have that the issues that they're dealing with at that time, I think understand that this is a solution. It's almost like you're getting involved in the group during a tough time. The leader or the group is saying, "See this? This is a solution to what you're going through. This is what you're looking for in your life. I can help you get there." So I'm catering to what I know you're looking for and offering you a solution to it. And so your eyes are fixated on here is the goal, but not necessarily the process to get there. At the same time, your needs can be manipulated. There was a psychiatrist who once said each person has a warehouse, I think he said, or storehouse of guilt inside them. I think the goal sometimes of leaders and leaders of groups is to find that storehouse of guilt that can be used against you. And what I mean by that is, like, if, for example, you're getting involved in the group and you say, I've always had problems making decisions in my life. Sometimes I decide I want to do this, I want to decide this, I'm not too sure about, you know, and yeah, so I want to really deal with that. Now things get really tough in the group, and you're starting to question and doubt maybe, and the leader, and I use this in a context where it doesn't have to be necessarily religious, because I think it's important to note that the groups we end up getting concerns about are not necessarily religious, but they also can be political, psychotherapeutic, deal with UFOs, really across the spectrum, I say, of ideas and ideologies from A to Z. So the leader can use this, the fact that you've kind of expressed, and this is one example of having difficulties making decisions. And here's a chance, now I'm presenting you with, you've got to do X, Y, Z, and you start to be a bit reticent about doing it. And me as a leader comes up to you and says, well, didn't you just tell me that you're always having a hard time making decisions in your life? Here's a chance to really deal with those kind of issues. I'm offering you a chance. Are you just going to continue again, not making decisions in your life? I thought that was important for you to deal with. So what we're saying here is like groups often will use a lot the emotions of guilt and fear to encourage people not just to stay, but to maintain their adherence to the movement. Because generally, as I mentioned, people are getting involved because they're looking for something that's going to respond to issues and conflict in their life. So they're looking for solutions. The reality, when you're going through a tough time, you're looking for a simple solution. Help me get out of this mess. Help me. I mean, I've just lost my job. My wife just left me. How do I deal with all of this? It's kind of almost the need that people have to have the father image when you were a kid, arm around your shoulder, saying, you know what? Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. I'll help you. And so it's the need to, let's say, that the group kind of wants to respond to what you're going through, but at the same time, we'll be using those kind of emotions of fear and guilt to encourage you to continue and go along with what you previously didn't want to go along with, because you're evaluating everything now with a different context. You've got to understand, according to the movement, that what you've previously believed and didn't really help you out. Here's a chance to progress and move ahead. And we're giving you this opportunity. So people, you know, over time, and most of the times it is a slow process because it's hard to get people to change dramatically. But if you can get them to change, incrementally, it becomes easier to do. Almost the example that came to mind is like, can I get you to, how do I get you to change? Well, I think in one group that we dealt with in the past, they would sell flowers, basically for a good cause, according to the good cause. And one former member found out that, well, this good cause wasn't really there, and said, well, isn't this lying? We're saying I'm selling these flowers, to save the world, whereas basically the money's going into our cause. And the explanation given to that person was, look, now, if your best friend's house was on fire, would you do everything possible to save their life? Yes, the former members. Well, spiritually, their life is in danger. Your chance, and this may be the only person's chance for them to do something good in their life, is give money to our organization. So once you can accept, this is not a major step that the person makes, it's a minor step. So, well, okay, in the context of his belief, this made sense. So that was a small step to accepting pretty much a lie. And so it made it easier. Once you've accepted one small lie, it becomes easier to accept, and go ahead with others. And it's the same thing with behaviors. Once, the other, I think, example is people don't like to stand out. If you remember the Rajneesh movement in the heyday, called the Orange People, or they all dressed in orange. Well, they don't have to force you to wear orange, but if you're not going to be there, let's say hundreds of people all dressed in orange wearing a three-piece suit, you're going to stand out. Generally, people don't like to stand out. So you've got a combination of factors going on. You've got the peer group pressure, as well as an explanation for why you should be doing something. Uh, Another example comes to mind in a group here in Quebec, where all the women wore dresses, and but they never said you have to wear a dress. But you came in, and it's your choice to wear a dress, yes or no. but you would be the only one. So basically, over time, conformity plays a big role in getting people to change behavior. And as I said, it's incremental. It's not dramatic change, which happens in most cases. It's incremental. And the more I can get you to make these small changes, the more it becomes easier to get you to accept other acts and other events that are occurring within the movement. So that when you get to, for example, an issue of sexual abuse, and it's clear that when you're talking about terms, we're talking about in terms of violence or sexual abuse, this is not how the member or the movement's going to perceive it and sell it to people. This is how we see it once people are out and once they tell you what they actually went through. Violence in a movement is not necessarily perceived as violence. If we're basically beating kids, we're not going to say we're going to beat kids and we want you to beat your children. We care, and some groups will use verses in the Bible to justify, let's say, punishing kids. And they say, this is punishment, but this is showing our love for our children because we don't want them to be corrupted by the evil satanic world if it's a religious context. And so that people come to believe that what they're doing is a demonstration of love, not what it really is, which is abuse and harm. And the same way that some women who have been abused sexually in movements are perceived to see this as a chance for them to reach a higher stage of enlightenment or the chance to be closely connected to the guru or leader or other leaders within the movement and do not perceive it as what it actually is while they're going through it. And so that's the hard part, I think, of trying to get that kind of awareness out. That is not simply people who are number one weak, nor is it just simply, well, they're going along with it. It's a process which gets people to conform to a certain kind of behavior and accept something that they would previously not find acceptable. And obviously, as we mentioned before, with children growing up in that kind of environment, that's just the norm, and they don't necessarily perceive it anything wrong with it.
I think that another part of this process and this sort of gradual evolution that really sets the stage for violence and is one of the really sort of substantial concerns for us here is isolation. So, alongside this process of normalization, you also have a decrease in contact with the rest of the world in some manner.
Yeah, the isolation part is an important factor. And isolation is interesting enough, does not necessarily imply that you have to be, hidden away in the woods, which is the image people have. Groups can be isolated even when they're in the city, because I think what's important to note is not as important. Physical location clearly helps because you can't get out, but the psychological kind of isolation that the group creates. In many ways, I view it as like, how do I get to create the so-called barbed wire of the fence around the compound and get that barbed wire around your own mind so that you end up controlling yourself. And that's the power. That's where the isolation part comes in. You start to distance yourself and distance yourself from family, friends, co-workers, people you used to be with over time and who you now perceive as basically evil or bad for your own spiritual or psychological, whatever development or progression. That becomes problematic because now more and more you're become kind of focused on the group itself and what the group validates as positive or negative experiences. And the more you can become isolated and cut off from other points of reference, and it's not just family, friends, and co-workers, individuals, but access to other information. Well, how does the group control your access to what you read, what you see, and how you live your life, as well as what you wear, what you dress, what you eat, etc. So this kind of process, and I think it is all part of that kind of isolation where group, the more I can isolate you from other points of reference, the more easily and more malleable I think the individual becomes within the context of an environment that where you have other people who are all seemingly indicating that what they're going through is something that's wonderful and fantastic and positive for their own kind of growth. But yes, I think it's important to look at that as a factor. It's not the sole factor, but as I say, I don't think there's any one specific thing that you want to look at as the only indication of where a group is harmful. You want to look at a number of these things to ascertaining, is there a risk? And if there is problems, how and why does it occur?
So I think that with the aspect of this presentation this morning being in the context of intervention, it would be good to talk a little bit about how these considerations can be applied by social workers, by people in the mental health field, by people who are in a position where a current or former member of this kind of movement comes to them, or where they are coming to that person, and how they can better go about their intervention from that point.
Yeah, I think that what I say for intervening, probably it applies, to everyone who wants to, kind of intervene in one manner or another, because of a situation that's occurring. Uh, I think I always start with like, one tends to look at situations like that with our own eyes. In other words, we look at it with our own perspective and worldview. What is important is to try to understand and see the world through the eyes of the believer. Understand, because if you're planning on doing any kind of intervention, you have to understand how the member and how the group potentially might react. Uh, Understand does not mean you agree or disagree. Understand means that you get a better idea, like I said, of what will work, what will not work, depending on what you want to do. And because intervening is always a question of, well, what's your goal? What do you want to do? You want to pull people out? You want to go in because you're youth protection or social services? You're a family member. You don't find what the individual that you care about is doing and concerned about their well-being. Same thing. How are they going to see what you're doing? And generally, the approach is it's not our kind of approach is not a confrontational approach. It's basically how to establish contact with the individual. The reality being, no matter what situation, if you have no contact, and that's where your question about isolation comes in, some groups actually have, encouraged members to cut off contact. So, you know, the first step for those, people or situations are how do you reestablish contact with somebody, which is a whole process as well, and is really kind of like case by case. The same way I would say, you always want to look at groups on a one by one basis. They may be similar, but I think you have to look at groups on a one by one basis, and then you have to look at situations of families or individuals within the group also on a one by one basis. They are not uniform. So that intervening, you have to take into consideration the person, where they are in their experience, also the group in terms of where they are in their experience, if you're a social service. If the group has had numerous contacts, for example, with agencies of the government, they may be highly resistant to contact or maintaining contact with you and be very kind of confrontational with you versus an organization that has never had, let's say, conflict with an agency or a family member. Approach then in that case becomes easier, but nonetheless, the contact that is needed is how to establish communication and contact with the person. Ultimately, if you have no contact, you have no idea what's going on.
It can
And
be a
once you have,
slow process, but it's not one that can be skipped.
yeah, the only time I think you are going into a quicker process is there really a concern of imminent danger. You know, that there's something catastrophic, or as we had one situation which occurred, the group gets up and takes off and leaves your jurisdiction of your social services. Then obviously, if there's that concern, you want to be able to intervene. You also maybe want to, if you're dealing with a group because there's a policy internally of abuse that's going on, you want to be taken into consideration. Okay, is there a flight risk for the group? Or is there a flight risk in any situation where you have a leader who's abused people and you want to pursue criminal charges, etc.? You have to take those things into consideration. Usually I say, what are the worst case situations or scenarios that can occur, and prepare for it. May not happen, but at minimum, at least you're prepared for it. So establishing contact, communication, and if you're dealing with individuals, It's how do you develop a trust relationship, develop trust. If the movement sees you or members of your family or organization as evil, possessed, demonic, part of society, then, how do you break down that barrier? What comes to mind is an experience I had early on when we first started Info-Cult. I was in the 80s. It was a social worker who had to deal with a group that I would say probably was the English, you know, component, not component, but rather the English version of a Rock Thériault group, which was well known in French society, in French Quebec, where basically he was a leader who lived with a number of women. I think he fathered about 17 or maybe more children with these women. They were locked into the house where they were staying, and I mean locked in is they usually, yes, you lock your door, but it was locked from the inside so that you couldn't get out without a key. There was a lot of experiences of abuse going on. The social worker, when she heard about this through families, etc., her approach was to establish contact with individuals one by one, slowly. And that level of trust developed over time, whereby she was able to help certain women who finally felt comfortable talking to her and said, I want to get out, and help them get out. I think this is important, that, like I say, the development, I can't understate the importance of that, especially if you know that the group has a really negative image of those on the outside. And it's the same, like, is, because if the group says all these people, all you out there are evil, negative people, and I built you all up as criminals, especially for those who are second generation or born or raised in the group, you want to establish kind of a reference, a contact, whereby the member starts to maybe say, well, maybe this person doesn't seem as evil and harmful as he's been portrayed by my leader and my group. If that's not the case, is there other situations where the leader may be wrong as well? But at the same time, I'm now maybe able to talk to you because I'm starting to trust and have a relationship with you. And I say I can't understate that enough because it's very hard and it's time consuming, to do it. And but it's, I think, very important, and especially in situations where that you're saying the group is isolated. Obviously, if it's isolated outside of a city in a very like distant location, some cases where people have been like kind of hiding out in the woods, it's not that easy to come into contact with them. That presents another kind of scenario where you have to look at potentially other options. But as I mentioned, this is a kind of general kind of an approach, but each case is different because you have to know the group, the history, a bit of what's going on, and then look at what are your goals here and are they achievable? And if so, can you live with the negative consequences of what you're trying to do? I mean, in some of the work I've dealt with as well, with law enforcement and social services, you look at, okay, here's a movement that's got a lot of potential to go public in the media and play up the fact religious persecution. How are you going to deal with it if it comes out? Whereas what your concern is that children are being abused, in the movement. So it's preparing for those situations, not meaning you don't do it, but at least be the best prepared you can before you intervene. Because there have been a number of situations, if one looks at it, where basically agencies and even families have failed. Once you fail in trying to do an intervention, then that can indirectly reinforce the conviction of belief of the organization that they're being protected, they are right, and see, they couldn't get away with it, which also is detrimental to the individuals within the group, because if the group gets away with it, even if the members may be having doubts or questions, that will just really kind of stymie that kind of process for the individual. So there's a number of these things to be looked at when you're thinking of doing an intervention. It's complex. It's not, as I'm talking now, is the people, there's often situations where people, well, just go in there and close them down. Well,
What does
you
that
know,
mean?
exactly, and you've had that as well, I'm sure, of people in your situation calling you up and looking for the simple go in and close them down and pull them out.
Yeah, I mean, we've even seen certain circumstances, like with Thériault's group that you mentioned earlier, where leaders in the movement and members are arrested They go to prison, they do a term in prison for whatever it was they were convicted for, and when they leave, they resume the activities of the group. So some of what we might have in our minds as being the solutions that deal effectively with these situations are not always quite what
No,
we expect them to be.
no. And even sadly, even if leaders, and there's been a few leaders convicted of crimes, you know, they continue to run their group sometimes from inside prison. So believing that just a simple, so it's not to say you don't do something. Clearly, not saying that, but recognizing that we're saying the fact that you may arrest the leader for abuse is not going to necessarily stop stuff from happening and stop the group from existing. You know, some groups, yes, will kind of splinter, fall apart, etc. But you can't take that as a given. You know,
And even after we've seen some groups disband, this does not mean that the former members of that group are left perfectly fine. I think that this also really we can use to highlight the importance of the individual approach because those individual members or former members will continue to have needs in the long term that were once met in
uh,
their group setting and that they now need to find new ways to meet. And that's something that we focus on a lot as well when we are engaging with people on the topic of intervention.
yeah, I think it's really important. Is like kind of when you talk, it kind of reminds me of the feeling that some people have is like they have someone in a group and they try to get the person out of the group, and so they're really concerned, they're really worried. The member is so-called happy, they're okay where they are. So, and once the family is able, for one way or another, to convince someone or get somebody out of the group, it's almost like, poof, they're relieved I got them out. But the former member now is out, but now they have a host of issues and problems that they may be confronted with upon leaving. So it's really kind of a switch, and recognizing that, yeah, once somebody is out or once a group may be stopped or no longer exists, does not mean issues or problems that individuals may have stop as well. That's why I think we were saying it's it's unfortunately we're dealing with a complex issue. I often say that these groups are created, structured, and formed around a human being. Human beings are complex individuals. Whatever they're going to create is also going to be complex. And dealing with individuals who are complex requires sometimes not simplistic solutions, but may require complex kind of, you know, ideas, and pretty much requires complexity. And I think conscious of a nuance when you're dealing with, situations where resolution is not always simple, and that's, I guess, the hard part of, I guess, some of the work we deal with, and you deal with as well, is the frustrations of recognizing that sometimes that there are not an easy solution or a simple quick solution. That solution sometimes takes a lot longer, especially in situations where we are aware of, let's say, people who have been victimized and harmed, who are seeking some kind of, kind of resolution, as well as kind of, let's say, acknowledgement of what they went through. And that's not always that easy because we didn't touch on it yet, but you know, what is known when you talk about the issue we deal with is some of the major kind of traumatic or dramatic experiences, like, I mentioned Rock Hill, Solar Temple, Heaven's Gate, Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. These are the stories, that get a lot of mass media attention and are the ones that are well known. Most people that we deal with are in smaller organizations or groups and are either not willing to go public or are confronted by a system which makes it difficult for them to go public or make a complaint. One woman comes to mind right while we're talking now is who was sexually abused, but was happened in another country. And when she wanted to seek redress, was told, and legitimately so, she would have to complain in the country where the abuse occurred. And unfortunately, it's in a country that is not well recognized for dealing with women who are sexually abused. and have a history of a lot of sexual abuse issues and problems in that country. So that's not always that easy. Plus, uh, some people are just really scared because they're fear of reprisals by the organization. Members, former members can believe, that they may be physically, victim of a physical reprisal. I have rarely seen such a situation occur, uh, but the individual believes that. And whether or not I believe it or not, they're dealing with that kind of fear of actually being potentially physical reprisal, as well as the spiritual element of reprisal can happen also. There is experiences that people go through in a movement which is reinforces the fact that you shouldn't leave, number one, and number two, you shouldn't be speaking out about what occurred to you. In situations where in movements they basically present it in a way that your only kind of solace, comfort, and protection exists in the group, and you can have examples. Well, where the leader may say, "Well, remember John? He left the group and day after he left, got killed in a car accident." Basically, leaving people who are in the movement with the interpretation that once you leave, you may even physically die because you've lost protection. So these are issues that come into play when I think you're dealing with somebody who's in the group. What are they going through? And why, if you want somebody to testify, why they may not be willing to testify about abuse going on within a movement too. So it's not just the victim themselves, but understanding that even for other members who may be witness to certain crimes, why they may not be willing to testify, but also getting them to recognize, and that's the process, like you're saying, is like what kind of questions to ask, to make people feel comfortable, to be willing and open to talking.
Yeah, I want to draw back to what you mentioned about the international issue here because a lot of groups operate internationally. And so taking an approach to the problems that happen in them where um, as a provider of help services, our vision is closed strictly to the locality that we're in, that can create a huge hurdle for people having their needs addressed. And that's one of the reasons why we really make an effort to maintain contact with organizations based in different countries in the world to the best of our abilities so that we can more effectively connect with other other people providing help services who can offer us some information about the context, the legal context where they're at, what the possibilities would be on the horizon for that person in that country.
Yeah, I think that's an element that really doesn't get, let's say, much, kind of like say coverage. That there are those kind of, let's say, various situations where abuse occurs in other places. Movements also can move people around. There are numerous situations where we've heard from people where they've gone to another country and they give up their passport to leadership, etc. So even if they want to leave, it's difficult. So recognizing that there's situations where there's ways of dealing with that, but it complicates factors, when it occurs because people have lost. I mean, when I was saying, it's not a question of just following a leader, but you've lost control really in many ways over all aspects of your life, and so that it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for some people to see a, a, a door to leave, as we say, so a door to leave the movement. And recognizing also when we're talking about it, I think there's an interesting term that's used, exit costs. What does it cost somebody to leave? Even if you've been abused and harmed in a movement, what does it cost you emotionally, psychologically to leave the organization? An example is if for you may be married in the group, but your husband and if you have kids are firm believers. When you leave, does that mean you may lose all contact with your family and friends if you have other family and friends in the movement? So it's not always that simple, and even for people who have acknowledged that there is wrong going on in the group they're in, Leaving it is not that simple a task. And that's where in some of the literature you start hearing the term PIMO, physically in, mentally out. Uh, they're still in the group, but for different factors, they are not leaving. And so that is important also in recognizing when you're dealing with a situation, where is the person you're dealing with in their stage of evolution of involvement in the group? Because somebody who is pretty much out, but is not leaving for different reasons, maybe somebody who could be more helpful in terms of what's going on. That's where, in some cases, you're dealing with a group. If there are people who have recently left, former members, they may be a very valid source of information to help you deal with situations of abuse and harm. Uh, I think when we're talking about this subject, I think it's important to underline we're looking at the abuse and harm that happens in the movements that we're concerned about when people call. Just the fact that a movement is new or different does not imply that we think that all new or different movements are harmful. That's where I say we have to look at groups on a one-by-one basis. Groups have a right to believe in what they want. There is no indication that they have a right to behave and do what they want. And so I think there's that clear delineation. And that's sometimes a concern when people want to intervene, is a concern that we're dealing with a religious organization, and that becomes worrisome because it's a negative and can become a political hot potato. Abuse is abuse, period. And whether it happens in a religious or a non-religious context, it's abuse. I mentioned before is looking at how people perceive things when they're in the group, you know, uh, and, and it's reminiscent of like a movement that was here in Montreal. There was a small little church where the leader, was having sexual relationships with a 10-year-old girl, who he, in quotation marks, married. So therefore, from his perspective, he was just having sexual relationships with his wife. Now, this was known within the group. It was a very small group. There was about maybe 12, 15 members maximum at that time. Uh, people knew, people knew it. And from all accounts, people, were, kind of, kind of that kind of like a impression of what was going on, but went along with it. I mean, he's also having supposedly sexual relationships with her sister, who was a bit older, but also a minor. Uh, so this was known within the group, but it came out publicly at one point because he was basically arrested. And once it became public knowledge and public in the media coverage of this going on, what people, I think, within the movement kind of saw as unacceptable now recognize it was also socially unacceptable, and got confirmation, and pretty much everybody left the group when that information came out, except for one person who remained a fervent kind of follower of the pastor. He ended up going to jail for that case. But it's recognizing that in certain situations, in this case, people kind of knew or kind of like, but didn't talk about it, but felt there was something wrong. It was only when it became not public knowledge that there was kind of like a hit in the face saying, yeah, this was wrong. In other situations, no, you're going to have a group where they're just going to circle the wagons, and no matter what the group leader does, he's explaining to us it's important, it's right, and basically it's an attack against the leadership of the organization, and they're trying to destroy the group, and members will continue to believe and basically circle the wagons. So different contexts, we talk about intervention, will require a different approach depending on what you know about the group and what's going on inside it.
And we've seen just about every possible outcome from these types of situations. So there's also, from what we've seen, not really a precise script that guarantees success here.
No,
There is better, there's worse, but there's no guarantee.
exactly. Uh, that's why it's always a question of, as I mentioned before, it's like you're trying to do something. What if it doesn't work? Can you live with the consequences? And as we mentioned, also, are you going to end up reinforced? That's why I say a better thought out intervention or approach, which may take time, is often tends to be much more beneficial than a rapid kind of quick, knee-jerk reaction. That was one of the situations that occurred here in Quebec in the 80s when one of the best interventions by youth protection took place against a small church that was basically probably one of the largest cases at that time of youth protection intervention of abuse of children. Uh, they took the time to really look at different approaches and ended up basically uh, closing down the group. I mean, they didn't close down the group, but because of their intervention, the group ended up closing down, and the pastor who was responsible, ended up in jail. But many other cases you see is there's interventions that are basically done rapidly because we're going to go in, and basically close the group down because that's what they think they're going to be doing, and it doesn't work out, and they have reinforced the conviction of the group. At the same time, if you have failed in terms of trying to achieve a goal, in some cases, agencies are going to be much more reluctant to even do it again because it hasn't worked out. And they may have gotten a lot of bad publicity because some groups will use the media to make it seem like an attack, a religious persecution attack, etc. That's why I'm saying you really have to, in some cases, be prepared in terms of the reaction you're going to get. Uh, Not all interventions are successful. Some of them are not carried out because, or are not successful because they were not well planned and not well informed about what they were doing and who they were going in against. You know, but at the same time, part of our work and some of the stuff we've been doing, and Sam has been involved with as well, is trainings that we've done with certain social services agencies that try to get people to aware of the complexity of dealing with this kind of phenomena and how to best intervene in different situations. And in some cases, certain of the agencies have specific concerns about groups we're very well informed about, so that we are able to provide that kind of information and knowledge about the history of the movement, what has been done, what has been successful, not successful, and what is the current state of knowledge about the group. And I think that's an important factor when you're looking at situations. To base information on documentation that's 15 or 20 years old may not at all be relevant to what's going on today. And I'm saying that on both sides of the spectrum. You could have a movement that was 15, 20 years ago. Basically, the material you may be looking at shows the movement to be very positive and beneficial. But 15, 20 years later, that may not be the case. The inverse may also be the situation where the movement has been problematic in the past, but today may have evolved because of different kind of interventions and approaches that have taken place over the years. So that just reinforces the need. I think when you're looking at this kind of phenomena, is yes, people are being harmed. People have been sexually abused. Children have been physically abused and treated. Even adults have been physically abused. How do you intervene in situations? You know, much as we may desire that we should go in like gangbusters and close them down, the reality is we have not been successful in closing down groups. People who firmly believe in what they do are unlikely to be just closed down. Pushing groups underground, you know, does not mean they stopped. We've just pushed them underground and we're less likely to know what's going on. In most cases that we've heard about, it's because you either have former members reporting when they leave, or there's been some kind of contact with the outside where an outside agency or people have been concerned about what's going on. Underground, and in some countries where there's been very repressive actions taken about groups, we just pushed them underground, haven't stopped them. They still continue. So it's a much more complex. Doesn't mean you don't try. What I'm saying, and I think it's important to recognize, you're dealing with a complex issue created by human beings who are complex.
We have another 5 minutes in front of us. So again, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can also raise your hand. But yeah, I suppose that one thing that I would like to emphasize, if this is the end of our time together, is that a lot of the time we take an individual approach because that's where we best have the opportunity to intervene. And that's where we have the best opportunity to have a positive impact and to be able to even ultimately reach out to a greater number of people impacted by violence or abuse in a given situation. And in the context of those individual interactions, something we found really very important is taking the person in front of us seriously on the terms of what they're describing, whether it's something that we've heard a million times before or whether it's something that's totally new to us, to avoid making the person in front of us feel like they're in a lab or like they're a zoo animal, to not direct unfounded curiosity towards them, but to focus really on what the needs that they're expressing are, and to find empathy for those needs and to come to connect and understand with them to be able to respond to them more effectively.
And that's a very important, I think, point, because former members have said to me, you know, I feel like I'm a lab rat in some cases. You know, I'm looked at, you know, like, and so you're kind of looked at in that kind of manner. It's highly, you know, you know, problematic and very difficult to assume that somebody's going to be willing to open up about experiences. You know, if you already see me as kind of weird and strange because of what I told you, I'm not going to reveal to you everything that went on. And the other situation that sometimes one should be cautious of if you're somebody works in intervention is that if I view you, I'm coming out of a group and I've been trained or, you know, kind of indoctrinated to view you as really kind of a negative and dangerous person, am I going to reveal to you that I was in a group? You know, I may be not reluctant. So the questions, you know, that you have to ask may vary than just simple questions. At the same time, also take into account what are the person asking you for help. If I'm coming in and saying I was in a situation where I was abused, you know, you may want to find out, number one, in what context did that abuse occur? And secondly, not necessarily reflect on, well, what was your childhood like? That's another thing that came up from former members, is that I came in for certain help and they all wanted to focus on my life as a kid. Uh, I'm not saying that it's not necessarily important to look at, but what's the primary demand that the person is making on their first visit to you? And so it's not going to be very helpful if you don't not able to respond to their requests, especially if you're trying to develop a relationship with somebody who's having a hard time dealing with authority or relationships of anyone outside the group.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I think that
Thank
we'll
you,
cap
Sam.
it off here. I want to say thank you to those of you who listened in, and I sincerely hope that there will be other activities and workshops, webinars that go on this week that are of interest to you. If you're not able to catch something live, we're also going to be posting stuff, as I mentioned earlier, to our YouTube channel afterward. So, you know, I hope you find something that's relevant and helpful to you here. And I wish you a good rest of your week.
Yeah,
Take
and
care.
I think just a note, it's on the calendar on our website, all the events that are taking place during this week. Thank you, Sam.
All right. Take care, everyone.